They didn't knock. They didn't call. They just slapped a bright orange violation notice right on my front door because my grass wasn't pleasant enough to look at. 2 weeks later, I was drowning in fines, threats of legal action, and letters calling my home an eyesore. All because I refused to pour hundreds of gallons of water onto a dying lawn in the middle of a drought. So I did something the HOA never saw coming. I ripped out every blade of grass and replaced it with a low-water desert rockscape that followed their rules perfectly and exposed how petty they really were. But when they realized they couldn't punish me anymore, they changed the game. What happens when an HOA can't control you the usual way? When I bought that little stucco house at the end of the cul-de-sac, I honestly thought I'd made it. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. A narrow driveway, a tired patch of grass out front, a cracked concrete walkway that baked in the afternoon sun. The kind of place realtors call cozy and full of potential. Finally, a place where nobody can tell me what to do. For a single guy who'd spent years in small rentals with thin walls and louder neighbors, it felt like an upgrade to a whole new life. The neighborhood looked like a brochure for suburban calm. Matching mailboxes, trees planted at perfect intervals, kids wobbling on bikes, parents waving from driveways, sprinklers hissing in neat little arcs every evening. On paper, it was peaceful, predictable, safe. There was an HOA, of course, but when I moved in, the board sounded harmless enough. A welcome packet with smiling stock photos, a thick rulebook I barely skimmed, and a friendly line about maintaining neighborhood standards for everyone's benefit. I signed the papers, nodded along, and figured it was just one more hoop to jump through to get the house. My life slotted in easily at first. I worked long days and came home late, pulling into that driveway just as the sun slipped behind the roofs across the street. Some nights I'd sit on the small front step with a glass of water and just breathe, listening to sprinklers tick and hum in a chorus up and down the block. It felt like the whole neighborhood was on a timer. My lawn, though, didn't get the memo. The grass had already been struggling before I moved in. Patchy, faded in some spots, stubbornly muddy in others. The previous owner had clearly given up somewhere around the second summer when the water bills started climbing and the city began sending out drought awareness flyers. I inherited a lawn that looked permanently exhausted. At first, I tried to play along. I set up a sprinkler. I bought fertilizer. I spent precious weekend hours pushing a cheap mower across that fragile carpet of green, telling myself that a few months of effort would bring it back to life. But the heat didn't care about my effort. Week after week, the sun baked the yard into a brittle yellow patchwork. Whole sections turned into dust and straw. The only thing that seemed to thrive were the weeds, shooting up defiantly in places where grass refused to grow. Every time I pulled them out, it felt like a losing battle. Inside, my life was simple. I cooked cheap dinners, scrolled through my phone, watched shows in the hum of the air conditioning. I wasn't hosting wild parties. I wasn't painting the house neon. I wasn't doing anything that could possibly bother anyone. Still, there were signs, small, easy-to-ignore signs, that this neighborhood wasn't as relaxed as it looked. The first hint came in the form of a friendly reminder tucked under my doormat. Printed on bright paper, it was dressed up like a welcome note with a cheerful header and a smiley face logo from the HOA. The message, though, was less cheerful. It said things like curb appeal, community standards, and property values. It mentioned my grass. It used phrases like appears neglected and may need attention soon. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't a warning, just a reminder. I shrugged it off. I had more important things to worry about than a few dry spots in the front yard. The city was asking everyone to use less water. The news kept talking about reservoirs dropping. Neighbors were quietly tightening their belts. It felt ridiculous to pour hundreds of gallons into a patch of ground that didn't want to stay green. But as the weeks went on, I noticed what the HOA clearly cared about most. The houses that seemed the most approved all looked the same. Aggressively green lawns, perfect edging, not a single dandelion in sight. Sprinklers ran right at dawn, misting the sidewalks and washing into the gutters, turning the street into a shallow river for a few minutes every morning. In the middle of a drought, it was like watching people pour bottled water straight down the drain. One evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I caught something I hadn't really seen before. The looks. A couple walking their dog slowed down as they passed my place, glancing at the faded lawn, then at each other. A neighbor across the street, still in his work clothes, paused with his hose in hand and took a long, evaluating look at my front yard before turning back to his own perfectly manicured grass. No one said anything, but the message was clear enough. My lawn wasn't like theirs, and this was a place where not like theirs didn't seem very welcome. I tried to meet them halfway. I trimmed the edges, pulled the worst of the weeds, raked out the dead grass. I even set my sprinklers to run a little more often, feeling guilty as I watched the water soak into soil that refused to stay alive. The bills crept up. The lawn barely improved. Out of frustration, I started researching alternatives late at night. Low-water landscapes, native plants, gravel, stone, and desert-style designs that could handle the heat without needing constant irrigation. I saw yards in other parts of the state that looked beautiful, minimalist, clean, modern, without a single blade of grass. It felt like such an obvious solution: save water, save time, and still have a front yard that looked intentional and cared for. But every time I thought about going for it, I would remember that thick HOA rulebook sitting in the kitchen drawer. I hadn't read it carefully before. Now, I started to wonder what it would say about changing the lawn entirely. Some neighbors already seemed on edge about small things. A trash bin left at the curb an extra day. A car parked the wrong way for a few hours. Holiday lights left up a week too long. Little infractions whispered about in driveways, followed by references to the board and the rules. There was this hum in the background, a tension you could almost feel when you walked down the street. Everyone smiling on the surface, but careful, always careful. Still, nothing truly serious had happened yet. No confrontations, no angry notes. Just that one friendly reminder and a few judgmental glances. It was easy to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was just being sensitive because I knew my yard didn't match the postcard look of the others. Then the weather turned hotter. The grass slipped from tired to ugly faster than I expected. The last patches of green seemed to give up all at once, leaving bare, dusty soil in several spots and thin, wiry tufts in others. It looked worse than neglected. It looked like it had lost a fight. That's when the letters started to arrive. Different tone, different wording. No more smiley logos and friendly reminders. Just cold official language, bolded phrases, and mention of violations and fines tied to the condition of my grass. And as I held those letters in my hands, feeling a pressure I hadn't asked for closing in around me, one thing became very clear. In this community, my front yard wasn't really mine. It was the HOA's. And they were about to prove just how far they were willing to go to make sure I understood that. The first real letter arrived on a Thursday, tucked neatly between a pizza coupon and a credit card offer. It looked official before I even opened it. Heavy paper, HOA logo at the top, my name printed in a font that somehow managed to feel accusatory. I stood in my kitchen, envelope torn open, and read each line twice like maybe I'd misinterpreted something. Your property has been observed to be in violation of Section 4.2, Lawn and Turf Maintenance. It went on from there. Words like unsightly, below community standards, negatively impacts neighboring property values. It listed specific issues: dead patches, discoloration, overall lack of uniformity. In the middle of a historic drought, my crime was that my lawn wasn't green enough for their standards. At the bottom, in bold, was the part that made my stomach turn. Failure to correct these issues within 14 days may result in fines starting at $50 per day until the violation is resolved. 14 days, $50 a day, for grass. I set the letter on the counter and just stared at it. Out the front window, my yard sat there looking tired, but not offensive. Not like the horror they'd described. It wasn't pretty, but it wasn't a junkyard. No trash, no broken furniture, just dry soil and struggling grass in a neighborhood that pretended the sun didn't exist. I tried to talk myself down. Maybe it was a form letter. Maybe everyone got one at some point. Maybe they just needed proof I was trying. So I tried harder. I watered more, even though every drop felt wrong. I patched a few spots with seed. I spent a weekend raking, trimming, and doing everything short of painting the lawn green. It made a small difference, but not the kind the HOA rulebook was written for. By the end of the 2 weeks, I knew in my gut it wasn't going to be enough. On the 15th day, the second letter came. Continued non-compliance with Section 4.2 has been observed. As a result, a fine of $50 has been assessed to your account. Additional fines will accrue daily until full compliance is achieved. $50, just like that. And a meter I couldn't see had started running. That night, I sat on my couch with the letter in my lap and my laptop open, reading through the HOA documents I had signed without understanding. The more I read, the more unreal it felt. They had rules about the exact height of grass, the acceptable shades of green in approved turf, even the percentage of yard that needed to be covered. There was language that made it clear. A brown, low-water yard was not just discouraged, it was unacceptable. They used words like aesthetic harmony and suburban character of the community, all coded language, all ways of saying you will look just like everyone else, whether it makes sense or not. By the end of the night, the fines had gone from a shock to something else entirely, something that felt like an attack. I wrote an email to the HOA. I explained the drought, the water restrictions, my concern about waste. I attached screenshots of city notices asking residents to cut back on irrigation. I offered to meet them halfway with low-water grass or drought-tolerant plants, or anything that wasn't just pumping water into dead soil for the sake of appearances. I pressed send and waited, hoping there was at least one reasonable person on the board. The response came 3 days later. Short, dismissive. Thank you for your message. While we understand your concerns, all homeowners are required to maintain their lawns in accordance with the CC&Rs. The appearance of your front yard remains non-compliant. Please be advised that fines will continue until the violation is resolved. No empathy, no options. Just the same line, comply or pay. The fines kept accumulating. $50 became $100, then $300, then $700. They added them up on their portal like a running tab. Every time I logged in to check, there it was. Outstanding balance, climbing over something that didn't hurt anyone, didn't damage anything, didn't make the street dangerous. It just didn't fit the picture in their heads. I started noticing small changes in how people acted around me. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away faster. Some avoided eye contact completely, suddenly very interested in their mail, their phones, the cracks in their driveways whenever I was outside. One evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I saw 2 board members standing at the corner of the street, clipboards in hand. They weren't talking. They were looking at my house, at my yard, at each other. It hit me then. I wasn't a neighbor to them. I was a problem on a list. That night, I sat in front of my laptop again, this time not looking at the HOA documents, but at something else. Alternatives. Low-water front yard ideas. Xeriscaping in HOA communities. Desert Rockscape lawn replacements. Image after image filled the screen. Clean, modern yards with gravel, river rock, drought-tolerant plants, and minimal grass or none at all. They looked intentional, beautiful even. They were everything my yard could be, without the constant drip of water and money. The more I looked, the more one thought took root. What if the problem wasn't that my yard looked bad? What if the problem was that it didn't look the way the HOA had decided a proper yard should look 20 years ago? I found stories too. Other homeowners in other communities who had fought their HOAs over water-wise landscaping. Some had lost, some had won. A few had gone to court, and judges had started to side with logic. In a drought, forcing people to maintain thirsty lawns wasn't just old-fashioned, it was irresponsible. It was that word, irresponsible, that stayed with me, because suddenly, it wasn't just about me and my money. It was about the idea that an HOA could pretend the environment, the city's water supply, and basic common sense didn't matter if it messed with their brochure-perfect image. The fines hit $1,000. I could have caved. I could have paid a professional lawn service to resod the yard, install a high-efficiency sprinkler system, and turn my front yard into one more hyper-green rectangle in a row of clones. But something in me was done being pushed. I made my decision on a scorching Saturday morning. The sun was already high. The lawn looked worse than ever, like it had given up on pretending to belong here. I stood in the driveway, looked at that struggling patch of earth, and said out loud, even though no one else was there, "This is the last summer you look like this." I called a landscaping company that specialized in xeriscaping and desert designs. I told them my budget, my HOA situation, and my goal. A low-water, clean, modern Rockscape that followed every technical rule in the book. We pulled the HOA documents apart, line by line. No mention of grass being mandatory, only neatly maintained front yards with approved materials. There were clauses about excessive artificial materials, but nothing banning rock or gravel as long as it looked intentional and matched the character of the community. Character. I could work with that. The landscaper sketched a plan, a mix of desert-colored rock and gravel, a few hardy plants approved by the city's drought-tolerant list, a dry riverbed feature running diagonally across the yard for visual interest. No garish colors, no weird sculptures. It would be neat, clean, tasteful, and essentially HOA-proof. It would also use a fraction of the water. Before we started, I did something the old version of me would never have done. I emailed the HOA again. I outlined my plan. I attached the design. I highlighted every line of their own rules that the new yard would comply with. I used their words, aesthetically pleasing, well-maintained, consistent with community standards, twisted back in their direction. I ended it with one sentence. This plan is fully compliant with our CC&Rs and addresses your concerns about my property's appearance. They never responded, no approval, no denial, just silence. Legally, that silence mattered. The CC&Rs had a clause. If the board didn't respond to a modification request within a certain time, it was considered deemed approved. So when that deadline passed and my inbox stayed empty, I marked the date on my calendar. Then, I got to work. The day the crew came to rip out the lawn, it felt like an exorcism. They cut the water. They stripped every last blade of grass. They dug down, pulled out roots, leveled the soil. The yard went from faded suburban to blank slate in a matter of hours. Dirt and dust, nothing else. Neighbors noticed. People slowed their cars as they passed. A couple of them actually stopped on the sidewalk and stared openly. One woman across the street stood at her window, phone in hand, filming or taking pictures, I couldn't tell which. In the afternoon, while the crew spread the first layer of rock, an SUV rolled slowly down the street and stopped right in front of my house. A board member. I recognized him from the corner, inspections. He didn't get out of the car. He just sat there, engine idling, eyes fixed on my yard. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion, annoyance, then something close to anger. He picked up his phone, made a call, still staring straight ahead. I pretended not to see him, but every cell in my body knew I was being watched. By the end of day 2, the Rockscape had taken shape. Warm, earth-tone gravel covered most of the yard. Larger stones formed a clean border along the walkway. The dry riverbed feature cut through the middle, filled with smooth, pale rocks that almost glowed in the sun. The drought-tolerant plants were small now, but they had a quiet strength to them, built for this kind of climate. It looked good. Not just better than before, but genuinely good. Intentional. unique without being loud. It made the rest of the street's lawns look almost wasteful by comparison. For the first time since the letters began, I felt something shift inside me, from defense to a kind of quiet defiance. The next morning, I woke up to a bright orange paper stuck to my front door. Not a letter this time. A notice of violation. The language was urgent and aggressive. It claimed I had altered the property's front yard without prior written approval. It called the Rockscape inconsistent with the community's aesthetic and demanded that I immediately restore the lawn to its prior condition or submit an approved plan for correction. At the bottom, they added a new threat. Failure to comply could result in legal action, liens, and additional penalties. I almost laughed. They had ignored my plan when it could have actually mattered. Now that the yard was finished, and undeniably within their own rules, they were pretending the process never happened. I took a breath, grabbed my folder of printed emails, circled the date of my original message to them, the timestamp, the policy that said, deemed approved. For the first time in this whole mess, I didn't feel helpless. I felt prepared. I sent them a new email. In it, I attached everything. The original design, my request, the date it was sent, a screenshot of the rule about response deadlines. I attached photos of the finished yard from multiple angles, labeled with notes about how it met every one of their documented standards. I quoted their own words back to them, highlighting the parts that mattered. Then I added one more line at the end, something I hadn't dared to say before. If you choose to pursue fines or legal action over a drought-compliant, fully rule-abiding front yard, I am prepared to involve the city and seek legal advice, as well as share this situation with local media. I hit send. I didn't know then just how much that last sentence would rattle them, or how ugly their response would get when they realized they couldn't beat me with the rulebook anymore. Because when the HOA understood that my desert rockscape was technically untouchable, they didn't back down. They changed tactics. And that's when this stopped being about a lawn and turned into something much bigger. The shift was subtle at first. After I sent that email, the one where I laid out every rule they'd broken and mentioned the words legal advice and media, the HOA went quiet. No new fines, no responses, no orange notices on my door. But the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like someone holding their breath. The neighbors changed first. One morning I stepped outside and found a folded flyer tucked under my welcome mat. No logo, no signatures, just a blurry picture of my house, my new Rockscape front and center printed in grainy black and white. Across the top, in thick block letters, "Is this what we want our community to look like?" Below the photo, a paragraph about declining standards, harm to property values, and residents who think the rules don't apply to them. It didn't name me directly. It didn't have to. Copies of the same flyer appeared in front of other homes up and down the street. Some ended up in trash bins by noon. Others stayed on porches all day, a quiet passive vote of, "We see you." That afternoon, I checked my email. There it was, a message from the HOA with the subject line, "Mandatory Special Meeting, Community Standards." The body was short. The board was calling an emergency meeting to address ongoing violations and threats to the integrity of the neighborhood's appearance. Attendance strongly encouraged. No mention of me or my yard. But I knew exactly who that meeting was about. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Cars lined the street, headlights cutting brief paths of light over my rockscape as people drove past. My yard sat there in the dark, neat and still, like the calm eye of a storm. Inside the clubhouse, the air felt thick. Folding chairs were arranged in rows facing a cheap plastic table where the HOA board sat. Papers fanned out in front of them like shields. The president, a man with a crisp shirt and permanently narrowed eyes, tapped a pen against his binder as people filed in. I sat near the back, not trying to hide, but not putting myself on display either. I felt eyes on me in flickers, quick looks, sideways glances, hushed whispers. The president cleared his throat. "We're here tonight," he began, because our community is at a crossroads. He talked about unity, standards, and the promise of this neighborhood. He mentioned how everyone, when they moved in, agreed to follow the same rules. His voice was calm, practiced, almost soothing if you didn't listen too carefully to the words. Then he shifted. Recently, he said, we've had a situation where a homeowner decided to make drastic changes to their front yard without proper approval. A quiet murmur rolled through the room. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Half the people in that room had driven past my house twice a day for months. They knew exactly who he meant. He went on. He talked about how the board had tried to work with this homeowner, how letters were ignored, and how non-compliance was escalating. He painted a picture of a rogue resident defying the community for no reason but stubbornness. I sat there, listening to a version of my life that had nothing to do with what actually happened. Then he picked up a stack of papers and held them up. This homeowner, he said, voice sharpening just a little, has now threatened us with legal action and media involvement, over grass, over something that every other responsible homeowner in this community manages to handle without drama. Laughter rippled through the front row. Something in my chest burned. He went on to propose new measures, stricter enforcement, higher fines, immediate legal steps for repeat offenders. He didn't say it out loud, but the implication was obvious. They wanted to make an example out of someone. Behind the table, one of the board members slid a folder toward him. He opened it and pulled out several color photos, clipped together. Even from where I sat, I recognized the angle. The photos had been taken from the sidewalk in front of my house. He held them up to the room. "This is what we're talking about," he said, voice heavy with disapproval. In the photos, my desert rockscape was perfectly framed, the clean edges, the dry riverbed line of pale stones cutting across the yard, the small, hardy plants spaced with intention. On the cheap projector screen behind him, someone connected a laptop and threw the images up larger. My yard, blown up for everyone to judge. He let the room take it in. A woman in the second row spoke up first. "It looks like a rental in the bad part of town," she said. A man near the front. "It doesn't fit. This isn't the desert. If people start doing that, we'll look like a strip mall parking lot." Another voice, sharper. "What's next? Plastic flamingos? Gravel driveways? We have rules for a reason." I sat there, letting their words wash over me, feeling each one like a small cut. Then, someone from the back stood. An older man I'd never spoken to directly before. Gray hair, button-down shirt, hands steady as he rested them on the chair in front of him. "I think it looks fine," he said. The room quieted for just a beat. He shrugged. "Better than some of the patchy dying grass I've seen lately. We're in a drought. Maybe we should be more worried about water than whether someone's yard looks like a magazine cover." The president gave a polite, tight smile. "Thank you for your comment," he said, already turning his gaze away. "But we're here to discuss enforcement, not personal taste." That was it. That was all the weight the one voice of support was allowed to have. He moved on quickly, pushing the conversation toward action. He started talking about a motion to authorize the HOA's attorney to file for a lien against my property if I didn't restore the lawn to its original, compliant condition. He spoke as if this was a formality, as if the outcome was already decided and tonight was just about making it official. My heart pounded. A lien meant leverage. A lien meant they could put a claim on my home over rocks and plants that used less water and followed their own rules. A lien meant this wouldn't just be about fines anymore, it would be about my future. The president looked out across the room. "All in favor of authorizing legal action." Before he could finish the sentence, I stood. The chair scraped loudly against the tile. Heads turned. The sound of whispers cut off mid-sentence. I didn't raise my voice, but I made sure it carried. "Before you vote on anything," I said, "you should at least hear the truth about what you're voting on." The president's jaw tightened. "This is a board matter," he said, fingers tapping on the table. Homeowners will have a chance to speak at the end. I held up a folder, my folder, thick with printed emails, screenshots, and highlighted sections of their own rule book. You've told everyone here that I made changes without approval, I said, that I ignored letters, that I'm just refusing to follow the rules like everyone else. That's not what happened. A few people shifted in their chairs, turning fully toward me now. I sent you my full landscaping plan, I continued, with pictures, plant lists, everything. I quoted your own guidelines back to you. I asked for approval in writing. And your rules say if the board doesn't respond within 30 days, a request is considered approved. The room went very quiet. I could feel the board watching me, calculating, already looking for a way to discredit what I was saying. I flipped open the folder, pulled out the first email, and held it up. This is the email I sent, I said, with the date and timestamp. I printed it in case anyone here wants to see it. This, I held up another page, is the section of the CC&Rs that says failure to respond within 30 days constitutes automatic approval. You didn't respond, not once, not with an approval, not with a denial, nothing. Something shifted in the room. The certainty, the easy disdain from some of the faces began to wobble. I took a breath and pressed on. You started fining me when I was trying to save water in the middle of a drought, I said. You ignored the city's notices about water restrictions. You ignored the fact that your own documents never say lawns are mandatory. You just kept sending letters about how my grass was ugly and unsightly. I let that word hang there for a moment. Ugly. How many of you, I asked, turning slightly to address the room, have watched your water bills go up? How many of you have gotten city emails telling you to cut back on watering? Do you really think it makes sense to threaten someone's home, their actual house, over whether their front yard looks like a golf course? A man in the middle row frowned, looking up at the projector, at the picture of my yard still frozen there. I saw his expression change, just a little. The president cleared his throat. This isn't the appropriate time. It's exactly the appropriate time, I said, feeling something settle in me. Not anger, not panic, something steadier. You want to put a lien on my home? You want to take legal action? Then everyone in this room deserves to know that you had your chance to object and you didn't use it. They deserve to know that what I did is exactly what your own rules allow. I reached into the folder again and pulled out the last thing I had brought, almost as an afterthought. A printed email from the city's water department. I also talked to the city, I said. They told me they're encouraging low-water landscaping. They sent me this. I held it up. A list of recommended drought-tolerant designs. Do you know what's on that list? Rockscapes, just like mine. I didn't wave it around. I didn't shout. I just let the paper sit there, solid and undeniable. And just so we're clear, I added, I didn't threaten you with the media because I wanted attention. I did it because I think people would be very interested to hear how this board is punishing homeowners who are trying to use less water when the entire state is being told to conserve. For the first time since I'd known him, the president looked unsettled. Not furious, not arrogant, just uncertain. One of the other board members, a woman who had been quiet all night, leaned over and whispered something in his ear. He shook his head at first, then stopped, listening. He turned back to the microphone, but he didn't look quite as sure of himself now. We will need to review this information, he said, each word chosen carefully. The board wasn't aware of some of these details. That's the point, I replied. You weren't aware, but you were ready to put a legal claim on my home anyway. A murmur rippled more loudly this time. Not the same scornful sound as before, something more complicated. Unease, doubt. A few faces that had looked hostile now looked embarrassed. A man in the back spoke up, louder than he probably meant to. If they didn't respond in time and the rules say it's approved, why are we even here? All at once, the carefully controlled narrative the board had built began to crack. They could have doubled down. They could have shouted, threatened, bullied, but they didn't. Instead, the president did something I didn't expect. He reached for his gavel, knocked it once on the table, and said, "The board will go into a brief closed session to discuss this matter. We'll reconvene shortly." The board members stood and filed out through a side door, clutching their folders and whispering furiously to each other. The room buzzed in their absence. Some people turned to me, asking quiet questions. Others avoided me entirely, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the floor. The man who had spoken up in my favor earlier gave me a small nod from across the room, like we were sharing some kind of secret. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. When the board finally came back, their expressions told me everything I needed to know even before the president opened his mouth. His voice was flatter now. Less performance, more damage control. After reviewing the documentation presented, he said, the board has determined that the homeowner's landscaping changes fall within the current guidelines due to a lapse in our response timeline. As such, we will not be pursuing further fines or legal action at this time. At this time. It was as close to an admission of defeat as I was ever going to get from him. A low hum passed through the room. Shock, reluctant acceptance. In a few faces, quiet satisfaction. I stood there, not triumphant exactly, but solid. They had tried to bury me in rules. I had used their own rules to climb back out. But as people began to stand, gathering their things, eyes flicking between me and the board, I realized something. Winning this battle didn't mean the war was over. They weren't going to forget this. The president's tight jaw, the way his fingers clenched around the gavel, the committee members' pinched expressions, they told me all I needed to know. The HOA had been forced to back down in front of everyone, humiliated, and people like that don't just walk away. They regroup, they plot. And as I left that room with my head held high, documents still clutched in my hand, I couldn't shake one question. Now that they'd lost the fight over my yard, what would they come after next? When I walked out of that meeting, the night felt different. The air was cooler, softer, like the whole street had exhaled. Cars were still parked along the curb, porch lights glowed up and down the block, and there, at the end of it all, my house sat with its desert rockscape quietly catching the glow from the street lamp. It no longer looked like a problem. It looked like a decision. As I walked toward my car, the older man who had spoken up in the meeting caught up to me in the parking lot. His steps were unhurried, his voice low. "You did good in there," he said. "Most people, they don't push back. They're too scared." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. The truth was, I'd been scared too. Scared of fines, of liens, of being the person everyone pointed at when they drove past my street. But in that room, when the board tried to twist the story one last time, something had clicked. Fear had been replaced with something sturdier, a quiet certainty that I wasn't crazy and I wasn't wrong. We talked for a few minutes in the dark, between idling cars and patches of half-lit asphalt. He told me he'd lived there since the houses were first built, long before the current board took over. It hadn't always been like this, he said. There had been rules, sure, but the board back then didn't treat them like weapons. Power changes people, he said with a faint, sad shrug. Especially when no one ever tells them no. On the drive home, his words replayed in my mind. No one ever tells them no. Maybe that was all I had really done. At home, the house was silent. I stood at the edge of the driveway for a moment, just looking at the front yard. The warm-toned gravel, the careful arrangement of stones, the little drought-hardy plants determinedly holding their ground. This was what I had nearly risked a lien over, this quiet, efficient piece of earth. The next few days were strange. There were no more letters taped to my door, no bright orange violations, no new fines ticking up in the HOA portal. When I logged in, my account showed a zero balance and a short, sterile note. Administrative review completed. The fines they'd piled on me over the grass, gone, or at least buried somewhere in their system where they didn't dare try to collect them. On the surface, the war seemed over. Underneath, though, there were ripples. Neighbors' behavior shifted again, but not in one clear direction. Some people who used to avoid me started offering small, cautious nods when I pulled in or out of my driveway. Not friendly exactly, more like respectful acknowledgement. Others went the opposite way. One woman who used to wave from her porch now turned and went inside whenever I stepped outside. A man who had once chatted about the weather at the mailbox stopped talking entirely, his eyes suddenly locked on his phone whenever I walked by. And then there were the curious ones. Over the next few weeks, I'd catch people slowing their cars as they passed my house, not to glare or judge, but to really look. At the lines of the Rockscape, at the plants, at the way my water meter was probably turning a lot less than theirs. One evening, as I was bringing in groceries, a couple from a few streets over stopped on the sidewalk. "Sorry," the woman said, almost sheepish. We heard about the meeting. We wanted to see your yard." They didn't ask for the story. They didn't dig for drama. They just stood there, taking it in. "It's nice," the man said, sounding almost surprised at his own assessment. "Looks clean. Looks like it belongs in this climate," the woman added. We ended up talking right there in the dusk for 10 minutes, about water bills, about the city's vague, half-hearted conservation campaigns, about how strange it was that planting a style of yard that actually matched the weather could cause such a storm. Before they left, the woman said something that stuck with me. "I thought the board would destroy you over this," she admitted. "They've gotten so used to everyone folding. I didn't know we were allowed to win." Allowed to win. That was what it felt like, in a way. Like I had stumbled into a game I didn't remember agreeing to play, and then somehow managed not to lose. But the board, they hadn't forgotten. Weeks after the meeting, their new strategy started to show. Not with me directly at first. New reminders appeared in mailboxes across the neighborhood, about trash cans visible from the street, about excessive holiday decorations, about non-standard patio furniture, petty little things, the kind of infractions no one had ever paid attention to before, suddenly treated as threats. It was like they were testing the edges of their power, seeing where they could still push without meeting another wall. I could feel their eyes on my house, even if I didn't see them. The board president's SUV passed my place more often, slowing just slightly as it went by. The same board member who had stared from his car when the rock was being installed now jogged down my street some mornings, gaze flicking toward my front yard like he was checking if the rocks had somehow turned into an army overnight. But they didn't touch my yard again. They couldn't. Legally, they'd painted themselves into a corner, my deemed approved landscape a quiet monument to their mistake and their overreach. The real impact, though, took time to show. About a month after the meeting, an email from the HOA landed in everyone's inbox. Proposed CC&R amendments, landscaping and yard appearance. They wanted to change the rules. They proposed language that would make traditional lawns the preferred and primary front yard material. They wanted to require explicit, written board approval for any non-turf dominant designs. They floated the idea of limiting rock or gravel to a small percentage of visible yard space. In short, they wanted to make sure no one could do exactly what I had done, ever again, without being technically out of bounds. They scheduled a vote. But here was the thing they didn't seem to understand. Once you show people the man behind the curtain, it's hard to convince them the wizard is all-powerful again. People talked, on walks, at the mailbox, in the grocery store parking lot. One neighbor sent the proposed amendments around with his own notes in the margins. This would make it harder to save water. What about the city's drought guidelines? Do we really want to be the only block on the news watering grass during restrictions? The older man from the meeting, my unexpected ally, started knocking on doors. I know because he knocked on mine, too. "We're organizing," he said simply. Not a rebellion, just a reminder that the board works for us, not the other way around. He and a few others put together a quiet, old-fashioned campaign. They talked to homeowners one by one. They explained what those amendments would really mean, not in abstract community standard terms, but in monthly water bills and city notices, and the ugly image of our little subdivision being the last holdout clinging to bright green lawns while everyone else adapted. The night of the vote, the board seemed confident. They always had, up to the moment they were forced not to be. They made their case in the clubhouse. This was about protecting property values, about preserving the original vision of the neighborhood. They used words like slippery slope and erosion of standards, as if a few drought-tolerant plants were termites chewing through the foundation of civilization. Then the ballots were counted. Page after page, they went through the stack. The amendments failed, not by a landslide, not by some dramatic cinematic margin, but by enough. Enough to say, no, not this time, not like this. It was the second time in as many months that the board had tried to flex its power and found a limit it hadn't expected. They didn't say much about it afterward. No angry emails, no public tantrums, just a brief, flat follow-up. Proposed amendments to CCNRs did not receive sufficient votes to pass. If you weren't paying attention, you could have missed just how significant that single sentence was. But the neighborhood felt it. Small changes crept in, almost imperceptible at first. A house farther down the street replaced one corner of its front lawn with a small gravel bed and a few native shrubs. Another homeowner swapped out a water-thirsty hedge for low, stone-bordered planters. In tiny ways, people started nudging their yards towards something more practical, more sustainable, a little less trapped in the fantasy of endless water. No one went as far as I had. Not yet. But the invisible fence of what's allowed had moved, and the board knew it. They still sent their newsletters. They still reminded people about trash cans and fencing and holiday lights. But there was a detectable caution in their wording now, like someone who'd been burned by their own match and hadn't forgotten the sting. They had learned in a very public way that pushing too hard, too blindly, could cost them control instead of reinforcing it. As for me, life settled into a new normal. I no longer flinched when I walked past my front window and saw the front yard. I watered rarely and intentionally, a slow drip at the base of each drought-tolerant plant rather than a mindless spray across a carpet of grass. On the hottest days, the yard shrugged the heat off better than the neighbors' lawns, which baked and browned and then flushed neon green again after desperate bursts of watering. My water bill dropped. Not a fortune, not enough to retire on, but enough to feel like I was living with the climate, not fighting it. Sometimes, when I sat on the front step in the evenings, I'd see cars cruise past more slowly than they needed to. A few would stop for a second, the drivers looking, thinking. Every so often, one of them would roll down a window and say something simple, almost shy. Hey, did you have to fight with the HOA to get this approved? I never gave them the full saga, not unless they really wanted it. Instead, I'd offer the heart of it. I followed the rules, I'd say, and I didn't let them pretend I didn't. Over time, the anger I'd felt hardened into something more useful: clarity. The HOA had not suddenly become noble or wise. They hadn't experienced a collective epiphany and thrown away their power trips, but they had run into an obstacle they didn't expect. Someone willing to read the fine print, gather receipts, and stand up in a room where they expected absolute deference. And that made them cautious. Maybe that's the most you can reasonably hope for with some people in power. Not that they change their nature overnight, but that they start calculating the cost of their worst impulses. The real legacy of that fight wasn't just a Rockscape in front of my house. It was the quiet, spreading awareness that the HOA was not a faceless, unstoppable force. It was a handful of neighbors with clipboards and titles who could be challenged, questioned, and, when necessary, overruled. It was a subtle shift from, "What will they let us do?" to, "What do we have the right to do?" Months later, the older neighbor who'd stood up for me in that first meeting invited me over for coffee. We sat at his kitchen table, sunlight hitting the edge of his own, very traditional lawn outside. It wasn't about the yard for him. It was about what the yard had exposed. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee slowly, "boards count on people being tired, too busy, too overwhelmed. They know most folks won't read every page or argue every point in front of a room full of strangers. That's how they get away with overstepping." He looked at me, studied me for a second, then added, "You reminded them that someone might." On the way home from his house, I realized something else. That whole time, I had thought the worst thing they could do to me was put a lien on my home. But the real danger wasn't the paperwork or the fines. It was the slow, creeping erosion of the belief that my home, and what I did with it, was still, fundamentally, mine within reasonable bounds. That I had any say at all. The board had tried to convince me, and everyone else, that our signatures on those CC&Rs meant we had traded in that sense of ownership entirely for the illusion of perfect grass and uniform fences. What I had pushed back against, maybe without even fully naming it at the time, was that lie. So when people ask me, now, what the lesson was in all of this, I think of those orange notices, those grainy flyers, that packed room with its folding chairs and cheap projector. I think of the moment when their carefully rehearsed story cracked under the weight of a single printed email and a highlighted paragraph. And I say this: if you live under an HOA, don't confuse confidence with correctness. Just because a letter is printed on heavy paper with a logo doesn't mean it's lawful, reasonable, or fair. Just because someone has president under their name doesn't mean they're automatically right. And just because a rule exists doesn't mean it's being applied honestly or that it should have existed in the first place. Read what you sign, know your rights, and remember that the board is not a distant government. It's a handful of people who rely on everyone else staying quiet. My desert Rockscape didn't just save me water. It forced my neighborhood to look directly at a choice it had been avoiding, cling to an outdated image, or adjust to a reality that isn't changing just because we wish it would. Some still hate it. Some quietly admire it. Some are slowly, cautiously following its lead. But every time I step outside and see that yard, I'm reminded of the night a room full of people watched a board try to turn personal preference into law, and watched that attempt fall apart under its own weight. So if you're wondering whether it's worth standing up, whether it's worth pushing back, whether you're making too big a deal out of something like grass, ask yourself this: if you don't push back here, on your own front yard, in front of your own home, where exactly do you think you will? And if you don't draw a line around the little piece of earth you actually live on, who gets to draw it for you?